Welcome, everybody, to Blood and Bone. Blood and Bone is a podcast of the Transcendent Truth Media Network. Today, we have a special guest on. We have Pastor John Hoyum of the LCMC. I'll let him introduce himself, what congregation he's in. Of course, you know he's in the Lutheran Congregations in Mission for Christ. A little bit about his educational background, what he does, who he writes for, where he studies. So, John, would you do the honors?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me on. I'm especially glad to be here. And, with Lutherans in North America in particular, one of the remarkable things for American Lutherans is getting to engage our friends north of the border, which is always a treat, even if it's a rare treat. But so I'm happy to be with some fellow Lutherans from Canada today. But yeah, just a little bit about me. I'm a Lutheran pastor serving in Seattle, Washington. My congregation is Denny Park Lutheran Church, and we're downtown. We're right by the Space Needle, which is quite the historic landmark of the city of Seattle. And so, yeah, we're right in the shadow of downtown, historic downtown space, Norwegian cultural background on this congregation, which is sort of the background that I grew up in as well. So I'm among my own people in a way. And yeah, we're affiliated with the LCMC, have been for like almost 11 years now. And the Augustana district within the LCMC, which I think probably later in the conversation, we might get to talk a little bit more about the Augustana district. But yeah, I've been here for 3 years now. And in that time, since I started at Denny Park, serving as their full-time pastor, I've been working on a PhD at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland. And Aberdeen is really cool. They have a distance learning module for their PhD. So I've been able to work on my dissertation while serving full-time in pastoral ministry, which for the kind of theology sort of situated between the academy and the parish that I really like doing, that's a particularly good arrangement. So yeah, in my free time, I like to write and obviously read a lot of books and talk to cool people like you guys. So thanks for having me on.
Yeah, we love to hear that. And I think it's really interesting, just as a way to open this up. I know we have lots of things to talk about, and you can let us know when you have to go. Usually we close up the episode at about an hour, but whatever works for you. If it's shorter, that's fine too. But I think a really important way that we can open this up, as all of us have been enjoying distance education and education in the setting of the parish ministry. Could you talk a little bit about why you chose Aberdeen and the importance of distance education and online schooling was for your choice there, and not only for your choice there, but for your life and the way that you live ministry and education in the seminaries?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's a model of education that I think is going to become more prominent in the coming years, and it has a lot to do with the sort of decline of church academic institutions, especially seminaries. And we're in a situation, I think, at least in American Lutheranism, where if we're going to sort of regenerate or renew the life of parish ministry and the life of Lutheran theology, the way that it's going to happen is going to be from within the congregation, and ultimately being able to rivet theological inquiry to the work of the pastor and to the life of the church is a particularly important thing. I think that that's the only way that we'll actually be able to renew, the task of Lutheran theology in North America. I mean, as you guys know, it's probably similar in Canada as it is here, but institutionally, the Lutheran Church doesn't take up a whole lot of space, right? So it's tricky to find your sort of institutional home as a Lutheran. So for me, being able to enter a program that's sort of flexible, like the one at Aberdeen, that allows me to work on my dissertation as I have time and do so in conversation with a supervisor, and of course, fitting it in with all of the tasks of parish ministry, that's been hugely important for me. It's obviously a different experience than what you would do if you were a full-time residential student at a university, especially a North American university. But I've benefited immensely from the education, and I have no regrets about pursuing this course of study, if that makes sense. So I don't know. I would anticipate that that more people in the future are going to do this kind of thing. It's particularly appealing, I think, for those of us who believe that an intimate connection needs to be made between theology and proclamation. But
Yeah, you might even say that theology is for proclamation, wouldn't you?
you might even say that. Yeah. It's not
Yeah.
like there's a book with that title, but
But if there was, we would definitely recommend it. Yeah, I
we would
really like
definitely
what you're saying
recommend.
about tying those two things together. And I think you're dead on that not even pandemic considered. One of the things that we've seen over and over and over and over again in North American Lutheranism and global Lutheranism is that it tends to be the seminaries that are driving everything. But one of the biggest problems with that is that what the seminaries have been doing for the longest time is taking individual candidates, removing them from the life of the people in the pew, and keeping them there for 3 years, and then sending them out towards the people in the pew without really knowing them, without really knowing what they need. And so tying those two things together, both forms and informs not only how ministry is to be done, but how seminary education is to be done.
Yeah, I think the kind of institutional problem with seminaries has been that the seminaries started to go off the rails when they became more distant from the constituencies that created them. I hesitate to bring up the example, but I've written about it in the past, and it's very obvious that this is the case with an institution like Luther Seminary in St. Paul. Luther Seminary in St. Paul has had to contract literally by selling off property, and it's unfortunate, and I'm not sure exactly how much people are aware of this, but it has a lot to do with the fact that institutions like that have cut themselves off from their constituents, whether it's rural Minnesota Lutherans or something like that. And those institutions began to atrophy precisely as they distanced themselves from the very people that they were founded to serve.
I think that's an extremely important insight, and we've seen that happen in real time to our seminaries, our Lutheran seminaries here in Canada as well. But beyond that as well, the university I went to, the seminary that I went to, basically, Ambrose, for instance, was founded by Nazarene and evangelicals. And of course, a lot of them were very fundamentalist. But the direction the university wanted to go was very much, this is an academic institution. So they, would do things very controversial to their donor base and their support base, like hire an evolutionary biologist, for instance, right? Which, as you can imagine, how some of the fundamentalists felt about that. Or they would hire a theologian with some views that I think would give the average fundamentalist a heart attack. So what ended up happening is they would pump out these pastors that would be talking about things and addressing issues that some congregation in the rural Alberta, which is a very kind of conservative Texas of Canada type thing, have nothing in common, and be like, what are you talking about? This isn't my experience, this isn't anything. And that idea of the divorce between the sort of academic areas and the parish, this is something that Bart was really passionate about, in a sense that he saw his seminary education as divorced from his pastoral education. But also, Luther himself, if you look at that, everything Luther did, it was out of concern for pastoral care. It was out of concern for the people in his pews, or even for the people that weren't in his pews that he would like in his pews. And so I think that's a very important and valid point. And I think that's something that's continuing to be addressed, because for the longest time, the last 200 years especially, I think there's almost been this Babylonian captivity of theology to the academy. And it's no longer practical anymore. It's an art. It's one of its own sort of studies. But what's the point of filling up if you're not dispensing out? And it seems as though that second part has been eroded at?
Yeah, I think the one concern that I have, just going forward with, sort of envisioning new models for theological education, is maintaining rigor, right? So one of the features of institutional entropy as it exists in North American institutions today is that a loss of rigor has been part of the decline. And so the question is, how can you re-envision new models for education of pastors and theologians eventually? How can you do that while maintaining an emphasis on the quality of the work and the quality of the education? So I think there's a danger in some sort of online approaches to education that perhaps cutting corners on quality is the way to get the job done. That's not going to last ultimately.
So let me jump in here just for a second. I think all that's true, but what I really want to there's two main things that we really want to talk about here. But before that, I just want to let all of the listeners know, and you can do this again at the end of the episode. But Pastor John also, he also writes a lot of things for 1517, especially blog articles. He also writes for, interestingly, the North American Anglican. He also writes a lot of scholarly articles and such. You can go and find all that stuff, access it, buy whatever he's written, look at it, spread it around, because it's wonderful and it's excellent. But Pastor John, what we really want to know about, firstly, is your research at Aberdeen, and secondly, well, first, let's stick with that first, and how that affects your general approach to Lutheran theology. And then secondly, we want to hear about your pastoral ministry at Denny Park and how the two things kind of fit together.
Yeah, well, there's plenty to talk about under the rubric of both of those questions. But yeah, my research at Aberdeen is on the American Lutheran theologian Robert Jenson, who many listeners might be familiar with. For those who aren't, Jenson was sort of part of a cadre of theologians who were born around 1930 in the American Lutheran scene, and he and several sort of colleagues of his age, like Gerhard Forde, Karl Broughton, Oliver Olson, and several others. Roy Harrisville would be another example. Many of them were raised in this kind of insular, conservative, confessional, Norwegian Lutheran context, and attended Luther Seminary in St. Paul, which I was ragging on a minute ago, but I'm a graduate of the institution as well, so I'm allowed to do that. But I find the history of that institution interesting too, and so part of my interest in that legacy kind of led me to Jenson. And Jenson was of a generation of pastors and theologians who matured in mid-century, so the 50s and the 60s, and they were among the first among immigrant American Lutherans to actually attend either American universities or German universities. And so Jenson is one of these figures who goes off to Europe to do a doctorate, gets to study with all the great lights of the 20th century, especially Karl Barth, and writes a dissertation on Barth, which Barth later says that he approved of, very interestingly enough, after sort of learning of the basic thesis of Jenson's work on him. And so Jenson served on the faculty of the Lutheran Theological Seminary at Gettysburg. He taught at St. Olaf College. He retired out of a sort of research position at Princeton. And throughout the course of his career, he wrote many books and contributed, not just to Lutheran theology on this continent and in the English language, but also to the mainstream sort of academic theological guild as well. So he's a person of major consequence, and some of the historical questions sort of led me to Jenson, and then also my own connection to him and to his legacy as well.
Yeah, Jensen is one of my absolute favorites. And if anybody goes to the TTM website, they can look at the About page. And if they look at my section on there, I mentioned some of my absolute favorite theologians of all time. And Jensen is on there. So let's talk a little bit specifically. What was it that drew you to Jensen? What was it about his approach to theology, about his love of Karl Barth, about all such things, and his relationship with Broughton, another one of my all-time favorites, and Forde, another one of my all-time favorites. We could also talk, if you would, about their approach to dogmatics, because as many probably know, your research at Aberdeen is specifically in systematic theology.
Right. Well, my interest in Jensen, I guess, lies kind of deep in my own biography. So my father is a Lutheran pastor, and one of the formative experiences of my life was in the car. We live here in the Pacific Northwest, and the geography here means that you spend a lot of time driving, and just because of the water and such and the mountains. So I spent a lot of time in the car with my dad. Well, and it turned out that that was an occasion for us to have very deep conversations about theology, and that's sort of where I discovered theology in the first place, was talking to my father. And my dad was a very scholarly parish pastor who was regularly reading the all the newest books, and was an avid reader of Jensen for a very long time. And I think the component of it that's interesting to me is that, so for somebody like my dad, he was a student of Gerhard Furdy's and a reader of contemporary Lutheran theology, people like Jensen and Pannenberg and such. And he was always aware of the differences and conflict between those figures or among those figures, but it never really stopped him from reading all of them and taking an interest in all of their theology. And so I kind of grew up with this conversation between Gerhard Forde and Robert Jenson, like in my own house, in the parsonage. And so when it came time, I went off to college and seminary and, studied with Steve Paulson, the successor to Gerhard Forde at Luther Seminary. And so I'm one of Steve's students, and I was sort of, I was encouraged to pursue doctoral work. And I was thinking, what kind of a topic would I write a dissertation on? And I kind of thought, it's very fitting that this kind of conversation or debate that I've been able to watch for several years of my life at home. That's actually the perfect thing to write a dissertation on. And so I'm sort of approaching Jensen from that vantage point of maybe a more conservative Lutheranism of the Fordean variety. So that's definitely a subtext to the research.
That's wonderful. And just for some of our more lay listeners, because I know that we have a huge lay base of listeners all around the world, of many different countries, especially in Europe, especially the Scandinavian countries and Finland. I know that they don't like to be included in the Scandinavian countries, but whatever. Could you just lay out for just briefly, or however you think best to explain things to laity? And I know that you're a master at this yourself as a parish minister and as a writer of blogs for 1517. What is the difference, or the differences per se, that one could say at lay level are there existing between Broughton and, even if you wanted to say Jensen, and kind of those two men usually stand together, and then Forde, and you could look at those different successors. You could look at Paulson, you could look at Mattis, and on the Broughton Jensen side, I don't know who you would name, but could you talk a little bit about that conversation you mentioned that was going on?
Yeah, I mean, there's several different ways that you could approach it. I think that one really helpful entry point for understanding maybe the difference between the kind of Lutheranism that a Gerhard Forde is after, from the kind of Lutheranism that a Jensen is after, has to do with what's kind of the primary way that God gets in touch with us. How does God reach out to us and encounter us, know us, come to us? Right. So these are both Lutheran approaches, right? So we're saying both positions would say God is the one who actually like comes and arrives and shows up and speaks to us. But how exactly does that happen? For a figure like Forde, the primary way that God actually shows up and arrives is through preaching. It's through the proclamation of the gospel. His book that we were talking about earlier, Theology is for Proclamation. So for Forde, it's the external word preached from the pulpit, delivered in pastoral care, delivered in the confessional, delivered in the conversation and consolation of the saints together. It's the word delivered in baptism. It's the word delivered in the Lord's Supper. This is my body. This is my blood. This is the primary way in which God breaks in and interrupts our old and sinful existence and imparts new life. For a figure like Jenson, I think the dominant sort of motif is story. So more so than preaching itself, what Jenson is after is a kind of understanding of God's action that is centered on narrative. And so the dominant thing that makes God sensible, and by extension our lives sensible, is the story of God's acts in history for us, which the center of which is Christ, of course. And so I think there's a bit of a distinction to be made between, which is the kind of dominant motif. Is it preaching or is it narrative or story? But as Lutheran theologians, they're united in their commitment to the conviction that the finite can contain the infinite. God actually arrives in this world to save in Christ. And so it's a question of what does that mean? How do we actually state that in the most concrete way possible?
Would you say that there's also a level, and this is I suppose a huge nerd question, and as many who know me know that I study at Luther House of Study, so I hear all the time about this Forde model and the proclamation model, and what I would really want, I don't want to give away what I believe because I might be wrong, and you're very more learned than I. But would you say here that in the difference between God showing up in proclamation and preaching and the sacraments and the absolution and the visitations and the mutual consolation of the brethren versus narrative theology and God showing up in story, that there's also there embedded within it a distinction between a particular and a universal?
Yeah, I think there definitely is, and the critique that might be lodged with Jenson would be that universal history of some sort or another is sort of yet another attempt to universalize the world in some way and then abstract God's relation to it. So like this is very similar to the old critique of kind of existentialist Lutheranism, which is that there's these things called word events, and they put you in touch with eternity. And there are these like little portals to the eternal. And what happens ultimately with that kind of approach to the external word is that it becomes actually an internal word. It becomes psychologized. It becomes abstract. It's something that is no longer situated in a particular for you situation, but it's a way of getting in touch with God in the abstract, but just in a slightly different manner. And so the critique of probably Jenson's narrative theology would be similar, that by trying to grant coherence and meaning and substance to the world and its story and the stories of the people in it, by kind of recurring to this universal history that in which everything has its place, that finally what's happened is that you have kind of Platonism of just under another name.
Well,
I'm not necessarily endorsing that critique, but I think that it's one that needs to be met, right?
And if I might be wrong here, but isn't that kind of the same critique that would be leveled against the new homiletic in general? Is the fact that there's the it's so focused on the story that it almost loses the historical part of the story. Because my interactions with some of the new homiletic is, it talks about, how do we get people to adopt the narrative for themselves? Like, okay, I want to become a Christian. Okay, you need to adopt the Christ narrative. But it almost takes the gas off the crucifixion, the incarnation, and puts it more on the story. I mean, that's part of the story, but it isn't necessarily the crux. And so would you say that that's kind of the issue that some people might see in Jenson then as well?
Yeah, well, I think the one thing that you said, particularly about how this kind of way of presenting things demands a decision, right? It demands that you actually do something, that you exercise your will in the proper way. And that's also a problem, because then it places the sinner in a cooperative relationship with God. Like, together we're going to get this salvation thing done, but as long as I hold up my end of the bargain. That may not be the problem with Jenson, but it certainly is the problem with psychologizing and rendering the word a kind of internal experience instead of an external thing. So
Yeah, a lot of the things that I myself try to do, and of course, my professors and supervisors can tell you whether I do this well or not, and I guess so can my parishioners. But one thing that I care a lot about is bringing together Forde and Jenson, and for that matter, Forde and Broughton, and for that matter, Forde and Kierkegaard, and all of such things. And if anybody knows me, they know that I love existentialism, but I also love the objective, concrete proclamation, and I love Paulson, and I love Mattis. And yeah, so that's really one of my questions, one of my concerns. How do we bring together, and I don't know if you have the answer to this, but maybe you have some insights. How do we bring these two great men together? How do we bring these two great, it's not really even as though they're separate, but in a sense they are, these two great schools of thought. How do we bring together the universal and the particular? How do we bring together the story and the preaching of that story, the experience and the news that causes that experience? How do we preach existentialism, if you would?
Well, I suppose my answer to that would be actually fairly simple, which is that I think ultimately, if you want to sort of see the way with and beyond Gerhard Forde and Robert Jenson, or any other really modern theologian that you might have a fancy for, I think if you want to see the way with and beyond them, it's ultimately to return to the scriptures and to the Lutheran confessions. Ultimately, I think that in the case of the Lutheran Reformation, the documents of that Reformation are our charters of freedom, and so to return to those confessions is the thing that will motivate and inform the actual delivery of the law and the gospel. So I think maybe reading the Book of Concord again is too simple of a recommendation, but ultimately, in the case of the Lutheran Church, the Reformation really is the thing that legitimizes our existence. And so for all of us to return to the Reformation once again, over again, always is usually the best way forward. So concretely, for me, this is serving a congregation, attempting to faithfully preach the gospel and administer the sacraments each week, to teach the scriptures verse by verse as much as I can handle. So yeah, returning to the basics.
And as you mentioned the confessions, of course, I have to ask, Formula of Concord, yes or no?
Well, that's what they call a trick question. No, I kid, of course. Formula of Concord, yes. I don't have any real reservations about the Formula of Concord. So I don't have any qualms about saying I subscribe unconditionally to the Book of Concord. But as you well know, that doesn't necessarily commit you to certain things. So we could get into that, but Formula of Concord, yes. What about you guys?
Yes. Yes.
Well, I'm just happy to hear everyone's in the elect now, so we can all die in peace.
Yeah. No, so one of my, and here's why I say that one of the really important things to me, not only academically and theologically speaking, but in parish ministry, one of the things that's extremely important to me is to bringing together narrative theology and Fordean proclamation, but also bringing together existentialism and confessionalism, is that I do not think that these things are mutually exclusive. And so one thing that's really, I don't want to say it's grieved me, because that's probably going to piss off a lot of my professors, but I'll say it, is that when folks go around and say that the Formula of Concord is bunk, and that it's this kind of throwing away of Lutheran theology for the sake of ad modem Aristotelis. No, not at all. Actually, it's really actually just genuine biblical truth. And that's what the preface of the Book of Concord states that it is. And that's what I confess that it is. And I'll die on that hill. Pastor Roland, do you have anything to say?
Well, other than no, I mean, I agree with your critique though there, Connor, and I know that would make a couple people emotional even at ILT too. But the fact of the matter is, having read through the confessions myself, having studied the confessions, and it really engaged with a lot of the literature, I would agree with you, Connor, and I would agree with you, John, on that matter with the Formula of Concord. I mean, at the end of the day, I don't see it being some sort of concession. I don't see it being some sort of sellout. I do think it is, in many ways, a very helpful extension of the logic that was already laid out in the Augsburg Confession, because one of the biggest problems that Lutherans face is the fact that, the Augsburg Confession and the Apology, more than anything, are legal documents, and they were answering particular questions in particular times. And sometimes that makes it hard to extrapolate over time, because often a critique Lutherans get is, oh, you're so caught up about justification, but nobody's asking that question anymore. Nobody asks, are you justified by faith alone? They may not know that they are, but they may think they are, or they may think that's their practice, but it isn't. But nobody's asking that question anymore. And so sometimes, Lutherans are seen as being stuck in the 16th century. But that's where I feel like something like the Formula of Concord helps fill in some of those things. And I think it's very valuable in that sense. That would be my take on it.
Yeah, and I would say, as someone who came from the Reformed Church and ended up leaving ultimately because of differences in confession, which really converged upon the Formula of Concord's discussion of good works and their role in salvation, especially during the time that this final salvation controversy, the final salvation by works controversy that blew up in the Reformed Church because of John Piper, is that if you lose the Formula of Concord on the article on good works, you lose everything. You lose everything, like absolutely everything. And so I would say if we don't have at least that, if we don't have the Formula of Concord, Article 11 on the doctrine of election and predestination, what do we actually have? Right? Not much.
Yeah, my approach to the Formula of Concord is sort of the impression that I get is that just rejecting the formula sort of out of hand seems it seems like just kind of wrong framing, right? So the inclination of some, like maybe the kind of modern Lutherans, is to just reject the Formula of Concord, in particular because of Article 6 on the third use of the law, which of course there's no third use of the law in Luther. It's a sort of later Melanchthonian innovation, and so of course we have to reject FC6 because it's not true Luther. But I think that that's sort of the wrong approach. And especially as I survey the landscape today and I see the attempts to offer what people think of as a robust third use of the law, it's simply not the doctrine that's actually in FC6. And so my position on it is, if you actually read the 6th article of the Formula of Concord carefully, you will find that there's no real disagreement with what the position that Luther offers himself, especially in the Antinomian disputations. And even if you were to use the Formula of Concord as a rule, I don't think even somebody like Gerhard Forde or Werner Ehlert would be out of conformity with it. So I sort of see the third use of the law debate as a fake debate in many ways, and the modern versions of the strong third use of the law are actually contrary to the text of that document itself. And that's, I think, the proper context in which to have the conversation about the formula. Does that make sense?
I think it does, yeah. And if I could just add before we move on to, because I'd really like to also discuss your parish ministry, but before we move on, I'd just like to add, yeah, I mean, when you look at the third use of the law as an instructive use, and then you look at the way that so many people who emphasize this more than anything else want to talk about it as this kind of non-condemnatory use, is you cannot have any kind of instruction of the law without it also accusing you, without it also curbing you. And so the law has to be understood as a cohesive organic whole, or else it's not going to be the law. It's going to be some kind of lesser thing, some kind of alien thing, some kind of thing that you really just made up on the spot. But without talking too much about that, could we then shift into a discussion upon your parish ministry? I mean, you did mention that you have a kind of unique situation there. Could you maybe enlighten us a little bit?
Well, it may not be super unique as far as like urban ministry in historic churches goes, but yeah, we have a historic building downtown, which means that we're sort of asset rich, facilities rich, but you know, as a city like Seattle has expanded, and in the past decade it's expanded a lot, the nature of the congregation has changed. So, you know, we have a smaller congregation, but we're able to sort of sustain, you know, a ministry here in the heart of Seattle, and the people who are involved are particularly keen on seeing that happen. So, yeah, I mean, that's kind of the nature of the parish, the kind of work that I do, or at least my approach to ministry is to try to embody an older paradigm for Lutheran pastoral work. So I place a heavy premium on visitation. I think visitation is very important, and teaching as well. I think getting, like I was saying earlier, you know, getting back to the basics is going to be the thing that revitalizes Lutheran theological education. It's going to be the thing that revitalizes Lutheran parish life as well. So for me, my approach has been to try to really engage our folks here in the study of God's word. And so my weekly routine includes, at this point, two Bible studies, try to alternate Old and New Testament. And I've found teaching the Bible to be one of the richest experiences in ordained ministry so far. It's truly one of the joys of the work, in my opinion. So I don't know if that sounds all that unique or extraordinary, but those are some of the highlights for me.
Visitations as well, because I do think that's very important, and it's very easy for pastoral people in ministry to get a bit lazy on that point. The sort of, well, you come to me model, kind of like how doctors are, right? Well, you book with the office and you come to me, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's very easy to get into that, but you're absolutely right. I think some of the most fruitful work that I've ever seen happen has been in pastoral visitation, in going out and calling people and saying, I'm going to come and see you. not hey, would you like to come and see me, and those sorts of things. So I think that's very valuable. A point a little bit connected to what you've kind of already spoken about a bit, and going back a little bit, is what do you make of Jenson's brand of ecumenism, particularly as sort of expressed in his canon and creed?
Yeah, well, that actually links up pretty well with sort of our discussion of parish ministry as well, because I think that one of the major problems with the modern ecumenical movement, and it's particularly its the version of modern ecumenism that's been popular among American Lutherans in particular. Forgive me for not knowing exactly, sort of the legacy of ecumenism among Canadian Lutherans, but I think that what we're seeing now is a shift from an institutional kind of paradigm for ecumenism. Like the way that you hammer out an ecumenical agreement is by getting theologians in the same room, and then they lay out theses, and then they argue about those theses, and then they come up with a joint statement. This is often called differentiated consensus, usually in the sort of more recent ecumenical theorizing. The problem with reconciled diversity or differentiated consensus is that the only place where that kind of ecumenism exists is like on the paper, literally on the piece of paper. You can see this with the joint declaration on the doctrine of justification, which is a joint statement by some Lutherans and some Roman Catholics. And there's no consensus between Rome and the Lutheran Church on justification, but there is between the people who got together and wrote this particular document. So I think what we're seeing now is I am a believer in ecumenism, but the place that I think that it's going to actually happen is on a parish level. It's going to happen within communities where people actually know each other and can communicate, dialogue, understand their differences, and be surprised and delighted by their areas of agreement. And I think that's a more modest approach. It doesn't have grand dreams of the reunification of Christendom, which seems kind of out of reach at this point in history, maybe compared to 40 years ago. But I think it's a much richer and more productive approach to ecumenism, something that happens on the level of the parish, and it involves lay people too. That's important as well.
Your insight there, because you're absolutely right. I still remember, a lot of people talking about when the Anglicans and Lutherans sort of signed those agreements as well. What happened in the States very much mirrored what happened in, same thing kind of happened in Canada. But for a lot of people, it said, oh, we're the same now. And then nothing changed, right? Because the bishops signed documents with each other, some hands were shook, some photos were taken, and then everyone just kind of went back to doing their own thing. And a lot of the parishioners at the popular level were just kind of like, oh, okay, or I guess we're the same now. And which is very interesting. And then, of course, ironically, too, it also led to some splits, because the Canadian Association of Lutheran Congregations started in that time frame in the 90s, and one of the original reasons it left is because, of course, the Anglicans wanted to reordain or sort of force an Episcopalian model onto the church, which a lot of some of the more staunch sort of Lutherans said, claimed a status of confession and say, no, you can't do that. So I think you're very right that brand of ecumenism, the institutional one, is in a sense a fake ecumenism. It's an ecumenism on paper, which isn't the sort of ecumenism I think that any of us really value or need, or the sort of ecumenism that Christ is speaking of when he says that I desire you to be one as my Father and I are one.
Yeah, that ecumenism is already accomplished as a promise made to the church, and as a confession that we make whenever we say the Nicene Creed. But the question of the particular ways in which our churches are divided is a local question. It's not really a universal question. The church is already one, as the thing which God has created for the proclamation of the gospel in this world. It's us that aren't one, and that's and so ecumenism, because of that kind of local nature, it's something that's, I think, best hammered out in the context of relationships between people in a particular place.
Yeah, and that's definitely also a difference between the NALC and the LCMC. But I think I also would like to mention here that on the issue of ecumenism, although that which the NALC hails, right, this kind of paper traditional approach to ecumenism, it does tend to filter down into the parish ministry. And I would say in a really negative kind of way, in my opinion, I would humbly say that, is that what ends up happening is you have this kind of fellowship, especially between Lutherans and Anglicans, as we traditionally saw it happen. And my problem with this, and I have no problem saying that I have a severe issue with this, is that we ended up having full fellowship, full altar and pulpit communion fellowship with those who may or may not agree with us on baptism, with those who may or may not agree with us on the Lord's Supper, with those who may or may not agree with us on who Christ died for, on what that death does, or so on and so forth. And maybe I'm showing my conservative colors here, but I really do not think there can be any kind of true ecumenism where there is not a unity on doctrine. Does anyone have anything to say against what I'm saying, or varying opinions, or?
Well, I certainly don't disagree. I agree that unity of doctrine is particularly important. But I also think that ecumenism is rightly understood as a contingency of history. It's something that happens in a particular place and time, and it didn't have to happen. And it's a response to the brokenness that we see in the institutional church. So while the pursuit of doctrinal unity is important, I think particularly for institutions that call themselves Lutheran, on the other hand, I think that there's nothing wrong with pursuing, at the very least, conversation with those who disagree. And perhaps the outcome of the conversation itself is informed disagreement. Instead of sort of fake and fabricated agreement, that's not real, that doesn't take up any space. At the very least, if you can achieve disagreement, that's a good objective for ecumenism, to achieve disagreement. And so if I can, so like here in Seattle, it's I hang out with the Missouri Synod pastors quite a bit, and I hang out with the Anglicans. And to simply achieve disagreement is often something that makes the friendship grow. So maybe that's a positive spin on what you just said. I don't know.
No, I fully agree with you. Yeah, I mean, like my issue, and we're almost at an hour here, so we'll very soon. Oh my goodness, did you guys hear that? Yeah, we'll very soon move into a discussion of the Augustana district before we let you go. But I think my main issue with ecumenism is not in discussing with other individuals or other churches, but it has to do exactly with what you're talking about, with real life, not with paper, not with declarations, but with who is coming to the altar, under whose pastoral care. And how can I know when I darken the doors of a church, right? How can I know what is going to be proclaimed from that pulpit? Because my problem is when we have full altar and pulpit fellowship and exchange of ministers with the ACNA or whoever, I don't know what I'm going to hear. I don't know what's believed by the one who hands me the Eucharist, right? And so that's where these... let's put this little man in jail, eh? But that's where this all hits the ground, and it starts to run, and it grows legs, and it starts to act, right? And so then we would say, what is really the church, and what do we confess as the church? It's those who believe, right? And it's those who are gathered around word and sacrament. So it's fancy and it's fun to write little documents, and me and Roland know all about this because we like to play on this little committee of whatever it's called, right? And write documents and say what is cool and what's not cool. But where this really takes form, where this really breathes life into its lungs, is when certain things are preached, certain things are taught, and certain things are believed in the congregation of the saints. And so what else do we confess? It is sufficient and thereby necessary that the church be united on word and sacrament. And it doesn't mean word and not sacrament. It literally means word and sacrament. And so that's my, I guess, conservative wannabe Missouri call to insisting upon kind of more of a doctrinal unity than at least we have in Calc. I can't speak for the LCMC congregations outside of Calc. What I can speak to is the problems that face me on a week by week, day by day basis. I don't know if Roland can say anything to that, but if he can, we'll listen to him. If he can't, maybe John has something to say about it. But if no one has anything to say whatsoever, and I'm just so absolutely right, absolutely true, and super wise, then we can move into talking for maybe 10 minutes, maybe less, about the Augustana district. Pastor John can tell you about that, and then maybe he can tell us a little bit about what else he's doing, what we can look for in the future, and then we'll let him go on his merry little way. How does that sound, guys?
Well, all I would add is simply I would put myself in a slightly more moderate camp than my dear friend Connor in terms of complete doctrinal unity. I think there are some non-negotiables, but I'm a little bit more willing to have a bit of a bigger sandbox for the parishioners to play in than Connor is, and you know, that's okay, because once again there's these rooms for disagreement at the end of the day.
And that's why congregations matter, right? That's why
Yes.
we're insisting on congregational rather than synodical institutional. Yeah.
Absolutely, because at the end of the day, that is where everything happens, really. And I think, building on John's point there, that's exactly what, you know, real ecumenism is. And not just between churches, but in the church itself. Because I mean, how many of our churches are full of people that aren't necessarily Lutheran? They didn't grow up Lutheran. Maybe they don't even identify as Lutheran. They just happen to find themselves at, you know, this church at this point in their life. And so, you know, these are all interesting questions, and I love this conversation, but that's my only addition.
Yeah, I guess I tend to think that in the future, there's probably a need for hammering out a somewhat clearer understanding of church fellowship in churches like the NALC and LCMC, to the extent that LCMC wants to talk about that. But you know, I think what you're articulating, Connor, is sort of the historic Lutheran position, right? Which is that the standard of fellowship in the church has both a low bar and a very high bar. And that one standard of church fellowship and the external unity of the church is the preaching of the gospel and the administration of the sacraments. That's not a particularly minimalist standard, right? That is the summary of the creed in a way, and it involves particular decisions to be made theologically about the doctrine of justification as the gospel, baptism as regeneration, you know, the body and blood of Christ truly present in the bread and wine of the Lord's Supper. So it's by no means a minimal standard, but I think that what you're kind of gesturing toward is, or maybe what you're in some way inviting, is further reflection on the question of church fellowship and what exactly the historic Lutheran position on that means for today. And I can only join you in inviting that kind of reflection. So
I'm glad to hear it. Now, as we close up, you're Twitter famous, I might say. You write for 1517.
That's disturbing, yeah.
It's disturbing. Well, me and Pastor Rowan were talking about this earlier. We both think it's equally absurd and fascinating that there is a vibrant theological Christian community on Twitter, of all places, mind you. So people can find you on Twitter saying masterfully wonderful things. Every day, you know, actually, I was telling Pastor Roland, I go on Twitter for two reasons. One, Jack Kilcrease. Two, John Hoyum. That's it. And then I close my Twitter app once I see what you guys have said for the day. And I say, that's the only thing that I'll find here of worth. Then I close the app. Mind you, okay, people can also find you at 1517. I don't know how often you write at North American Anglican, but I've seen you there at least once. Do you have anything you could say about what other things you're working on where people can find you?
Yeah, so if people want to find my writing, yes, you can find my scribblings and sort of reading notes and occasional intellectual pugilism over at Twitter. My handle is Johannes Flacius, which is a 16th century reference that few will understand. But if you do,
so we all know
good
where
for
you
you.
stand now. Okay.
Yes, indeed. So yeah, I'm on Twitter. I usually signpost like stuff that I write over at Twitter. That's kind of a good clearinghouse for my stuff. I try to keep a fairly concentrated online presence. I do run an academia.edu page where I post any sort of open access or permissioned writing that I've done for like academic journals, and you can find some of my book reviews there. I'm an avid book reviewer. I love reviewing books. I find the art and the craft of taking an argument and trying to speak about it accurately. I find that a very welcome challenge. I enjoy that. So there's that. Let's see, where else can you find my stuff? There is a page at 1517.org where you'll be able to find my blog posts at 1517. I write there semi-regularly. I haven't for a while. I actually posted something last week, but I try to be relatively regular there. And that's just sort of, I really, really like the kind of genre of the 1517 blog post, because it's kind of in this really nice space between, it's not an academic article, but it's elevated enough to where it's above a sermon, and might have a little bit more lingo than a Bible class, but it's in this kind of short, sweet, to the point kind of space. And so yeah, I'm really happy about the work that 1517 does as well. And then you also asked about things coming out potentially in the future. Nothing really major at the moment is in the works, but pertinent to our conversation today, I do have a short piece on Robert Jenson coming out in Lutheran Forum that should be out this year. So that's sort of that'll actually be very on topic for our discussion for today. So I talk about Jenson and some of his ecclesiology, his approach to ecumenism, and then kind of where it stands today. Where is Jenson and his reception at today? So, if you have any interest at all in that, look forward to that. I also have a kind of review essay of Luther's Outlaw God coming out in Word and World as well. And so that's kind of my friendly reactions to Steve Paulson's trilogy, Luther's Outlaw God, which is a series of books on predestination. So you'll be able to
which
find
is
that
extremely epic, by the way. But
yes, it's quite something. So I was happy to be able to write down some of my reactions and record them permanently so that Paulson can know exactly where we stand.
That's what he should do. Yeah. I myself don't agree with him. I'm just saying it's extremely epic. But he knows full well that I don't agree with him because I sent him emails about it.
Well, maybe that would be a topic for another episode. I'd be interested to hear.
Yeah. I mean,
but
for sure. Yeah, I have actually recorded my position on the doctrine of election. For anybody who's interested, they can find that at the Rev Connor podcast. Now, you can go if you want to, but you can also say something if you want to about the Augustana district. And if you don't say anything, I'll just talk about how it's the elite among the elite of Lutheranism. So this is on you, right? If you don't say anything, that's what's going to be said, just so you know.
Yeah, well, the Augustana district folks, for those who don't know, it's a non-geographic district within the LCMC, Lutheran Congregations in Mission for Christ. And the unspoken motto of the Augustana district is to put the L back into LCMC. So LCMC does not have a reputation for being the most, let us say rigidly Lutheran institution in the world, but the Augustana district folks are attempting, to bear witness for the gospel and for confessional Lutheranism there. And so the Augustana district is great. I hope that its ministry is blessed and grows in the future. And so I've been fellow travelers with those folks for a long time.
All right. Well, I'm pleased to hear it, and I'm pleased that everybody joined us. Pleased about Pastor John Hoyum. Pleased about Pastor Roland Weisbrot, and I'm pleased that all the listeners that we have listened today. Roland, do you have any closing remarks before we let the listeners go?
No, just very thankful that you came and joined us, John. We definitely enjoyed our conversation and hope to see you again in the future, because I feel like we scratched an itch and it just keeps getting itchier, doesn't it? So thank you for your time, and thank you, listeners, as well. Loving these series.
All right. Well, God bless everybody, and I hope you have a blessed Lord's Day, and I hope you have a blessed week following. Take care, everybody.